So late last week, Pitt got another transfer commitment, their 12th of the offseason, potentially their last. We'll see if it ends up being their last. We'll see where they go from here. But they added one more transfer commitment, and it came in the person of Kataris Hicks, a wide receiver from Louisville, who you might recall from catching like 6 passes for about 60 yards in Louisville's win over Pitt earlier. Not earlier, but late last season. Now, Hicks is the third wide receiver to pick Pitt out of the transfer portal. And in total, really the 6th wide receiver to be joining the roster between transfers and recruits this offseason. Now, Hicks committed late in the week last week. We didn't really get a chance to talk about it. We had the mailbag on Friday, and then obviously yesterday we just talked about Pitt's basketball game against Louisville, which happened on Saturday. So we haven't really gotten a chance to talk about Kataris Hicks committing to Pitt and what he'll add to the wide receiver room. But the reality is we could probably talk about that in just a few minutes, and we like to fill up about 20 here on the Morning Pitt. So let's talk wide receivers overall. Has Pitt gotten it? And this is probably a question we'll ask about a lot of positions throughout the offseason. But has Pitt gotten enough and gotten what it needs out of the transfer portal at wide receiver this offseason? 3 wide receivers have committed from the portal. But what kind of impact are they going to make? What do we really expect out of these guys? Kataris Hicks being the latest to join Pitt from the portal. What do we think they will add to the roster and how they'll help Pitt and the offense in 2025? Let's talk wide receivers, transfers, recruits, returning players, see how this position's stacking up heading into next season. Well, I mean, more directly heading into spring camp, which will start in about a month and a half or so. What's the wide receiver position look like? Have they gotten what they need? Let's break it down here on the Morning Pitt. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's the Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com hanging out with you today, getting a little Pitt sports talk in. Obviously, we'll have a lot of basketball to talk tomorrow in advance of tomorrow night's game at Florida State. Don't forget, that's a 9 o'clock tip-off, and that always gets interesting when we have a 9 o'clock tip-off on a Wednesday night. Obviously, that would interfere with our regularly scheduled live Panther-Lair show, which goes 8:30 to 9:30 every Wednesday night. We won't be able to do that. We won't go live 8:30 to 9:30. We're not going to expect you to turn off the Pitt basketball game and listen to us. So instead, what we'll do is we'll start at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. We'll have a live show starting 8 o'clock. We'll go 8 to 9. Me and Jim Hammond will talk with you about Pitt sports. We'll talk about the transfer portal. We'll talk about Pitt basketball, Pitt football, anything you want to talk about for an hour. And then we can all turn off the live stream and turn on the Pitt basketball game and do that. So we'll be live tomorrow night at 8 o'clock right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'll go for an hour as a sort of pregame show leading into Pitt, Florida State tomorrow night. And, of course, tomorrow morning's Morning Pitt will be about that game, previewing that game and some, couple days later thoughts on Pitt basketball after the loss to Louisville and what they're going to need to do against the Seminoles tomorrow night in Tallahassee. So we've got that. Don't forget, if you typically tune in at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, don't do that. You'll miss some or all of the show tomorrow night. We'll be starting at 8 p.m. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of our Pitt video content, these daily Morning Pitt videos or our live shows that we do, click the subscribe button just right down there. And then you can turn on notifications. So every time we go live at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, you get an alert sent to your phone. You know exactly about it. You won't miss anything. So, tomorrow is a unique time, a unique start time for us instead of our typical 8:30 p.m. start time. It's a little bit unique, and so we, that happens from time to time. And if you want to make sure you don't miss a time change or any kind of other alterations to the schedule, turn on your notifications, and then you will be locked into it. All right. And, of course, like this video. We appreciate when you do that as well. Okay. Wide receivers. So Kataris Hicks committed to Pitt. He's a young guy, second-year player who's in the 2023 recruiting class, went to Louisville, and is transferring to Pitt. He had his best game. Caught about 6 passes for I had the I can find it later. But he had a good game against Pitt. When Pitt played at Louisville, and it wasn't just garbage time. He had, I think, most of his catches in the first half. Kind of ran the same route, but he was able to break a few tackles and get some decent gains out of it. Recorded a couple first downs in the game against Pitt, and it really was the best game of his short college career at Louisville. Hicks is another guy who's right in that probably 5'11 to 6'1 range, decent speed, looks like a solid route runner, good hands. He was very productive in high school. He was a very good prospect coming out of high school. You can understand the appeal. And I think that applies to Andy Jean, the wide receiver they're bringing in from Florida as well. Guys who were really good in high school, but maybe in their first year or two of college didn't exactly get the opportunities they were hoping for, so they went into the transfer portal. I like Hicks as an addition, just like I liked Andy Jean as an addition, and I think a lottery ticket like Deuce Spann, the 6'4 wide receiver coming in from Florida State, who started his college career as a quarterback in Illinois. That's fine. He's got 1 year of eligibility left. Take a flyer on a big guy who can run like he can. I keep pointing out he was a 6'4 wide receiver, and he had a 99-yard touchdown return on a kickoff in 2023. There aren't a lot of 6'4 guys returning kickoffs 99 yards for a touchdown. So, hey, for a wide receiver room that could certainly use an influx of size, I think it's a worthwhile lottery ticket, a worthwhile investment to see if you can get anything out of a guy like Deuce Spann. But here's the thing that stands out to me. And I can't help noticing this first. I can't help that my eyes are drawn to this, but it's just the reality. And I got my legal pad out. Dropped paper in the process. I got my legal pad out to go through this, okay? Guitarist Hicks, career catches, career production, 13 receptions for 160 yards and no touchdowns. Deuce Spann, career production, 15 receptions, 216 yards and 2 touchdowns. Andy Jean, career production, 6 receptions, 97 yards and no touchdowns. Combined totals for Pitt's 3 incoming transfer wide receivers, career production, 34 receptions, 473 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, there's always caveats, and there's little things like this. Guys got hurt. Guys were behind other guys. Deuce Spann is an older guy. He's in his 5th or 6th year or whatever it is. Andy Jean and Guitarist Hicks are much younger. They're, second-year guys. And so, they haven't really, gotten a chance to blossom in college yet. And you certainly don't want to write off anybody after their second year of school when they just have a handful of catches. And you also don't want to dismiss the possibility that a guy could have low production in his first few years of college and then go somewhere else, play in a different kind of system and blow up, have a great career, do really well. But to take all of your guys, for all of your transfers to come in with minimal production, minimal resumes, and minimal, reason to, minimal evidence that they're playmakers. And again, I'm not dismissing the possibility that they are or will be. And they all showed potential in high school. Hicks and Jean were very good in high school, which was somewhat recent. Deuce Spann was in high school pre-COVID, so it's been a little while for him. But little flashes here and there. But you'd like to have a little bit of productivity coming in. And I got to be honest, if you look at this year versus last year in terms of transfer wide receivers, I was a little more bullish on Raphael Williams and Sincere Lee coming in, because those guys, despite coming from the FCS ranks, and the 3 guys this year are all coming from Power 4 programs of Louisville, Florida State, and Florida. Those guys last year, even though they were coming from FCS, and I know Raphael Williams was at San Diego State, but he didn't play there. He was effectively coming from Western Carolina, just like Sincere Lee. Those 2 guys combined had more than 200 receptions. Combined had like 3,000 receiving yards. Combined had almost 30 receiving touchdowns. Raphael Williams, when he came to Pitt last year, had career production of 120 catches for 1,600 yards and 15 touchdowns. That's what he did in 2 years at Western Carolina. Sincere Lee, 2 years at Western Carolina, 82 receptions, 1,400 yards, 14 touchdowns. These guys were productive. They had done something, and it didn't hurt that they had done it in this offense. They knew how it worked, and they had a proven track record of success in the offensive scheme. Kanate Mumfield, when he came in as a transfer 3 years ago, came in after 1 season at Akron, having caught 63 passes for 751 yards and 8 touchdowns. Lower level? Yes, but productivity, it's there. And this is probably one of these questions that I think particularly programs like Pitt, but all programs are going to wrestle with as they move through the transfer portal era. And this is a part of the transfer portal era that I don't think is going to change. I think this whole process and system is still very much in flux, and it's going to be changing over the next few years. But I think one part that's always going to be very interesting to watch and very interesting to monitor to see how schools approach it, is whether if it comes down to an either or of the very productive guy from a lower level or the guy from a higher level who has not produced, but maybe has the pedigree and is coming from a big-time program. Which way do you lean on that? I think that's a really interesting question. If you have the opportunity for Raphael Williams and Sincere Lee, who, again, combined for 200 catches, 3,000 yards, 30 touchdowns, or, Kataris Hicks and Andy Jean, two young players from power programs who combined in their careers for 19 catches, 230 yards, and no touchdowns. Which way are you leaning on that? It's a very interesting question. It's not philosophical because that's that's not the right word for it, but I think it's an interesting question of evaluation of what you kind of, and you make these decisions sometimes in high school. With high school recruits, you take the really productive guy from a lower level, or maybe somebody who's a little less productive, but he played at a higher level. How do you balance that out? I mean, you could see a linebacker from Central Catholic go to college and not really produce, and then there's Braylon Lovelace, really productive guy from Single A who goes to college and has had a pretty good career so far. I think about a guy like Chris Burns, remember, from Wilmington. Where did Wilmington play? Single A, Double A back in the day, and people were comparing his highlight film to his high school highlight film to Steve Slayton. Well, he never did anything. And so there's always this question of well, you're very productive, but what level are you productive at? And how is that going to translate? We're coming off a season watching Pitt where there were some very productive players from lower levels who had pretty good seasons. Desmond Reed, who pops up on the screen at the perfect time, is a great example. Very productive at the FCS level, and it translated. Raphael Williams, fairly productive, and it more or less translated. What was his final stat? I had the Pitt receiving stats up here. Raphael Williams finished with 34 catches for 390 yards and 5 touchdowns. Now, he was the number 2 receiver at best behind Kanate Mumfield and potentially Kenny Johnson. Sincere Lee, is number 5, or 4, I guess. Number 4 receiver. He caught 19 catches for 254 and 3 touchdowns. But I think those guys coming in, I had more optimism about them, and I was more bullish on their chances of success based on the productivity they already had. We know they can make plays in college football. FCS versus FBS notwithstanding, we know they can make plays in college football. We don't know that about Kataris Hicks, about Andy Jean, and about Deuce Spann, who's been in college longer than both of those guys put together. But then, there's the other element of, if you are Pitt and a school at Pitt's level, if you want to take players from power conferences, you're probably going to have to look for guys like this. Right, if you want a player from a power conference school, you're probably going to get the guys who have not produced much so far. Guys who feel like they just need an opportunity and then they can really shine. And so you go get Dejon Reynolds, who had 12 catches for 239 yards and 2 touchdowns at Florida. You go get Derek Davis, who barely transitioned to running back by the time he transferred to Pitt. Lucas Krull. Kylan Johnson, or Will Gragg, and that's pre-transfer portal. But again, bringing in a guy from Arkansas who hadn't really done much, you're trying to give him that opportunity. And sometimes it works out. Lucas Krull did really well. Kylan Johnson did really well. Will Gragg, not so much. Dejon Reynolds probably could have done more if he had been given more of an opportunity. But still didn't ultimately end up producing all that much. Now, then you have Kanate Mumfield, right? Kanate Mumfield catches 60 passes for 750 yards and 8 touchdowns as a freshman at Akron, comes in at Pitt and is pretty productive given the opportunities that existed. I thought he did pretty well in his Pitt career, playing in that offense for 2 years in 2022 and 23, and then I think really shining and excelling this past season. Probably, like Kenny Johnson and Dejon Reynolds, could have done even more with more opportunities and probably deserved them. And so it's an interesting question about how you approach the transfer portal. And we're talking particularly about skill guys here, but it even kind of, trickles down to linemen. Are you looking more for that guy who has started 3 years or 2 years at low-level Power 5, Power 4 school, or potentially FCS school? Or are you looking for that guy who's been sitting on the bench at the Power 4 school and looking for an opportunity? Do you and this is cherry picking options here, but do you want Stefano Millen, who was a multi-year starter and all-conference player at Kent State, or do you remember the guy who replaced Stefano Millen, that Nolan Lizio from Michigan, who wasn't playing and comes in? He actually did start, but I don't think he was particularly good. Brandon Hodges was a couple years ago. That was 2017. Again, pre-portal, but a transfer from Texas, an offensive lineman who wasn't playing, comes in and really didn't contribute all that much. I feel like most of the examples I'm giving are guys who came in from the power schools without a lot of track record or resume, and they don't end up doing much. So maybe my own personal preference is that you lean toward the lower level guys and go get them and bring them in, the productive lower level guys versus the guys who are supposed to have a lot of potential and upside but haven't really shown it yet at the higher level schools. I guess maybe that's my personal preference. I don't know if it's cut and dried across the board like that it's just either or, but I guess I am kind of leaning that way, maybe because of the examples I keep bringing up, but maybe those examples are telling the story, right? The most productive transfers Pitt has gotten, not without exception, but the most productive transfers Pitt has gotten have typically been guys who came in from those lower levels. Stefano Millen, Desmond Reed, Kanate Mumfield, all come to mind. But then there are, there's Kylan Johnson, there's Lucas Krull, there's Donovan McMillan, who all did well coming in as transfers. Actually, I think every guy I just said there came in from Florida, oddly enough. So maybe Pitt should get more Florida transfers. It's something the coaches have to consider, because ultimately they're asking the question about how it's going to translate. And you have a lot of film on those lower level guys who have played a lot and been really productive, but you have to determine how well you think it'll translate to the ACC level. Are they going to be good enough? Okay, this guy had billion yards at Western Carolina. Is he going to be able to do that in the ACC? Well, they found out Desmond Reed could. But then, the flip side is the quarterback. Right, Eli Holstein was a guy we're talking about in this category, like Katara Hicks and Andy Jean. Holstein had played even less at Alabama than those guys have played at their schools, and Pitt took him on the potential of a young guy who was stuck down on the depth chart at a power conference school, and he came in and shined. Had a really good year, and I think he'll be even better. In 2025, assuming he can stay healthy. It's a balance. It's an interesting question. I'm curious what you think. If you could pick one or the other, would you prefer the highly productive guy from the lower level or the less productive, less experienced guy from the higher level? And I know it's not a perfect question. It's not a perfect either or question, but I think it is an interesting one. On the whole, the receiving core, Pitt bringing in, like I said, the three transfers, Kataris Hicks, Deuce Spann, and Andy Jean. They've got Raphael Williams and Sincere Lee back, although I'm curious to see when Lee returns. I think that injury he suffered late in the season was a pretty severe one, and it might keep him out at least through spring camp, and maybe we'll see what his availability is when it comes time for August. Kanate Mumfield's gone. He's done. Dejon Reynolds went in the transfer portal, as did Lamar Seymour. But Pitt does return Kenny Johnson, who should be the number one option on this team next year, one of the top quite frankly, the top playmakers on this team next year offensively should be, in no particular order, Eli Holstein, Desmond Reed, Kenny Johnson. And they should be the guys who put up all the big numbers. Kenny Johnson, it's almost shameful that he only caught 44 passes this season for 520 yards and 3 touchdowns. I don't am I even looking at that? These are the regular season stats. I apologize. I thought something seemed off about this, but yeah, that's regular season stats. But it's still shameful that Kenny Johnson would only have 44 catches in 12 regular season games. He needs to have upwards of 60 next season, and really should be in the 70s. I think, with how good he is and how this offense should be getting him the ball. It should be in the upper 70s. They've also got Tyreek Robinson back, who I think showed some promise and some potential as a true freshman this past season. Zion Fowler-L coming back as he'll be a redshirt sophomore in 2025. And then Cameron Montero, who will be a redshirt freshman in 2025. And then 3 rookies coming in. 3 recruits, Bryce Yates, Tony Kinsler, and Cameron Sapp. Sapp was the signing day ad. Yates and Kinsler have been committed for a while. A lot of these guys all sort of feel like the same guy, all relatively short, pretty good speed. If you get them the ball in space, they should be able to make a play. But you got to get them the ball and got to catch it. I think that's probably what makes Deuce Spann stand out so much is his size. Kenny Johnson has got decent size. I think Kataris Hicks is, Hicks and Andy Jean are both sort of maybe north of 6 foot, which makes them bigger than a number of the other receivers on the team. So I think that's notable and worth considering. But this wide receiver group, I think Kenny Johnson should be your number one guy. And if there's any justice in this world, he will be the number one guy. After that, I think Raphael Williams showed enough flashes. Is he ready to step up and be a number 2? We'll see. And then it's just such an unknown. It's such a crapshoot with Hicks, Jean, and Spann because of the lack of production. 3 guys playing for 2 years each for Hicks and Jean. Spann has been in college for 4 or 5 years. So you're talking about like 8-9 years of college experience, and they've combined 34 receptions. 2 touchdowns. So you don't really know what you're going to expect out of that. So I'm going into spring camp in the summer thinking the top receivers on this team are Kenny Johnson and Raphael Williams. Now, I don't know who's number 3 after that if Sincere Lee is out. Now, we may get to the end of spring camp and Hicks and Jean and Spann will be the men, the guys, the dudes, and the dogs. All right, I'm done. And they'll have elevated to a higher position, and they'll be among the top 3 or 4 receivers. Maybe. We'll see. For right now, because I don't know what to expect from those guys, whereas I've seen a lot of Kenny Johnson, I've seen a lot of Raphael Williams, like those 2 are the top guys. It'll be interesting to see. As always, it'll be interesting to see what happens with these transfers. All right, we're going to talk Pitt, Florida State tomorrow, and we'll probably recap that game on Thursday. We'll have the mailbag on Friday, so we'll put up a post today. Go to Panther-Lair.com, and you can submit your questions for this week's mailbag. That's at Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Go to the Between Fifth and Forbes message board. Look for the mail time post and put your question there. I think we might have had some questions left over from last week, so we'll try to get those if we can. And that'll be good. That'll be good. We'll have a lot of fun with the mailbag as we always do. But thanks for watching today. Appreciate it. Hope your week's gotten off to a great start. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And we will catch up with you tomorrow to get ready for Pitt, Florida State, right here on the Morning Pit on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.